The Hi-Fi murders were the torture of 5 people, resulting in 3 deaths during a robbery at the Hi-Fi Shop, a home audio store in Ogden, Utah. On April 22, 1974, Pierre, Andrews, Roberts, and 3 other men drove in 2 vans to the Hi-Fi Shop at Washington Boulevard in Ogden, just before closing time. 4 of the group entered the shop brandishing handguns while Roberts and another man remained with the vehicles. 2 employees, Stanley Walker, age 20, and Michelle Ansley, age 18, were in the store at the time and were taken hostage. Pierre and Andrews took the 2 into the store's basement and bound them. The gang then began robbing the store. Later, a 16-year-old boy, Courtney Nasbitt, dropped by to thank Walker for allowing him to park his car in the store's parking lot earlier that day, was also taken hostage and tied up in the basement with Walker and Ansley. Later that evening, Orrin Walker, Stanley Walker's 43-year-old father, became worried that his son had not returned home and went to the store. Courtney Nasbitt's mother, Carol Peterson Nasbitt, also arrived at the shop later that evening looking for her son, who was late getting home. Both Orrin Walker and Carol Nasbitt were taken hostage and tied up in the basement. They had contained a total of 5 hostages in the basement. With 5 people now held hostage in the basement, Pierre told Andrews to get something from their van. Andrews returned with a bottle and a brown paper bag from which Pierre poured a cup of Drano brand drain cleaner. Pierre ordered Orrin to administer it to the other hostages, but he refused and was bound, gagged, and left face down on the basement floor. Pierre and Andrews then propped the hostages into sitting positions and forced them to drink the Drano, telling them that it was vodka laced with sleeping pills. It immediately caused blisters on the victims' lips, burnt their tongues and throats, and peeled the flesh around their mouths. Ansley, still begging for her life, was forced to drink the Drano, although Orrin said she coughed less than the other victims. Pierre and Andrews tried to duct tape the hostages' mouths shut to hold quantities of drain cleaner in and to silence their screams, but the oozing blisters prevented the adhesive from sticking. Orrin was the last to be given the Drano, but seeing what was happening to the other hostages, allowed it to pour it out of his mouth and then mimic the convulsions and screams of his son and other hostages. Pierre became angry because the deaths were taking too long and were too loud and messy, so he shot Carol and Courtney Nasbitt in the backs of their heads, killing Carol but leaving Courtney alive. Pierre then shot at Orrin Walker but missed. He fatally shot Stanley before again shooting at Orrin, this time grazing the back of his head. Pierre took Ansley to the far corner of the basement, forced her at gunpoint to remove her clothes, then repeatedly forced himself on her after telling Andrews to leave for 30 minutes. Afterwards, he allowed her to use the bathroom while he watched, then dragged her still naked back to the other hostages, threw her on her face, and fatally shot her in the back of the head. According to Orrin's testimony, her last words were, "I am too young to die." Andrew and Pierre noticed that Orrin was still alive, so Pierre mounted him, wrapped a wire around his throat, and tried to strangle him. When this failed, Pierre and Andrews inserted a ballpoint pen into Orrin's ear. Pierre stomped on it until it punctured his eardrum, broke, and exited his throat. Pierre and Andrews went upstairs, finished loading equipment into their van, and left. The bodies were discovered almost 3 hours later when Orrin's wife and her other son came to the store looking for them. Orrin's son heard noises coming from the basement and broke down the back door while Mrs. Walker called the Ogden police. Stanley Walker and Ansley were already dead. Carol Nasbitt was taken by ambulance to St. Benedict's Hospital, but was pronounced dead on arrival. Courtney, although not expected to live, survived with severe and irreparable brain damage. He was hospitalized for 266 days before being released. Orrin Walker survived with extensive burns to his mouth and chin, as well as the damage to his ear caused by the pen. He was also extremely traumatized after watching his own son die in a very painful way. In spite of his injuries, Orrin was able to give a description of the 2 leading robbers. Pierre, Andrews, and Roberts were charged with first-degree murder and aggravated robbery. Survivor Orrin Walker was a star witness for the prosecution. Due to his amnesia, Courtney Nasbitt was unable to testify. His father, Byron Hunter Nasbitt, did testify. During the trial, it was revealed that Pierre and Andrews had robbed the store with the intent of killing anyone they encountered, and in the months prior had been looking for ways to commit the murders quietly and cleanly. The 2 repeatedly watched the 1993 film Magnum Force, in which a prostitute is forced to drink Drano and is shown immediately dropping dead. Pierre and Andrews decided that this would be an efficient method of murder and decided to use it in their crime. Pierre, Andrews, and Roberts were charged with first-degree murder and aggravated robbery. On November 16, 1974, Pierre and Andrews were convicted of all charges. Roberts was convicted only of robbery. 4 days later, Pierre and Andrews were sentenced to death. Roberts was sentenced to 5 years to life imprisonment and was paroled in 1987.